What's this show? I hear you shout. Rock and metal is what I'm talking about. Rock and metal invasion. Rock and metal invasion. Rock and metal invasion. Rock and metal invasion.
Hi, and welcome to Rock and Metal Invasion. My name is Steve. Coming up on the show today, we've got a special guest. We've got Tim Durling here, and he is here to talk to us about his brand new book, Red on Black, The Listener's Guide to Sammy Hagar. How you going, Tim?
Doing very well, Steve. Thanks for having me on. And thanks for picking up the book. That's awesome.
Oh yeah, no, I love it. No, another great read. I think it's your. I'm almost losing count now. You've been so busy. It's your fourth book, is that right?
Four.
Yeah.
4 books in 3 years is pretty crazy. Considering that 5 years ago I had no idea I was going to end up doing this.
Yeah, yeah. It's been good. It's been really awesome, and I mean, we're going to talk about it today. Talk a little bit about Sammy Hagar, but as we were just saying before we started recording, that there's a lot to cover, right? So there's a lot in this book. He's been a busy guy, Sammy Hagar. We were just saying, he's had solo stuff, but then there's all these bands he's been a member of, lots of compilations, lots of live albums, and you pretty much cover it all, don't you?
I tried to make it as complete as possible. I mean, it's concentrating on his solo albums, the albums that his name is on specifically. But I do have a chapter. I have a chapter on Montrose. I have a chapter on Van Halen, and I have a chapter on Chickenfoot. But other than that, all of his, Sammy Hagar and the Wabos, Sammy Hagar and the Circle, the HSAS. I give each of those albums their own chapter. And yeah, there are a lot of them. I mean, since he started recording, I don't think there's been too many, gaps where there hasn't been something new that he's appeared on. So yeah, he's been very prolific all these years, and he's talking about putting new music out with this last lineup that he did this Best of All Worlds tour with. So I may have to go back and add another chapter, and I'd be very happy to do that.
Yeah, no, it's crazy, especially I don't know, how old is he? Like, because he looks amazing.
He's 77 years old. I mean,
yeah,
and he's still singing at, he's not singing like he did when he, in the mid 80s, but he's doing pretty good considering there are guys that are 20 years younger than him that can't sing at all anymore. So he's taking care of himself, and he's made so much money off, the tequila and the Cabo Wabo, and he doesn't have to do it. He doesn't have to make music, and he doesn't have to go beat himself up on tour anymore. So he obviously does it because he wants to do it. He's an entertainer at heart. And, I think it's pretty admirable that he's just out there putting out new music at a time when, we all know new music doesn't sell, especially by veteran artists. And a lot of classic rock bands, a lot of my favorites, they just stop making new music, but he's never stopped. So I think that's pretty cool.
Yeah, it is really cool. Yeah, exactly like what you say. He doesn't have to do it. The guy's got plenty of money, so you got to really respect the fact that he's just willing to get out there and just do it for his love of music and putting out new music, and also going out on and doing concerts. So, and at 77, it's just unbelievable. But and I was thinking about probably one of his periods where he was sort of not so prolific was the time he was in Van Halen, right? Because
well, yeah, the odd thing is that he was coming out with an album every 1 or 2 years. But Van Halen worked at a different pace, and it got slow. 5150 comes out in 86. Oh, you 812 comes out in 88. Okay, a 2-year period. Then for Lawful Carnal Knowledge, 91. There's 3 years now. And then 91 to 95 before Balance comes out. So yeah, it just gets more and more protracted. And I'm a huge Van Halen fan, obviously, but when in 1996, when there was the split with Sammy and Van Halen, Eddie and Alex in the press kept saying he didn't want to work, he didn't want to work. But if you look at what he's done post Van Halen, how many albums he's put out, and what Van Halen put out, it's not a lot of music to listen to, and that's a shame. I wish there was. I still hope that we'll hear more of the unreleased Van Halen stuff eventually. But Sammy kind of put his money where his mouth was, and he just, every 2-3 years here comes a new album.
Yeah.
So yeah, you're right. I mean, on his own, it's funny because on his own he works faster. But as much as I'm a fan of a lot of his solo albums, I still think that he does his best work as part of a band, because the first Montrose album, I think, is an all-time classic. I mean, so many bands have covered songs from that. I love all the albums he did with Van Halen, and I really like the 2 Chickenfoot albums. And I think when he's got another strong personality to bounce things off of, I think that he comes up with better overall. I think he comes up with better music. Not that he hasn't put out a lot of great solo albums on his own, but he does work best in a band context, I think. And in recent years, I was really disappointed that Chickenfoot didn't continue. Although the odd thing is that he's basically got the second incarnation of Chickenfoot, because he's got Joe Satriani, he's got Michael Anthony, and he's got Kenny Aronoff on drums, and that's the band that did the second Chickenfoot tour. So we'll see what happens with that. But yeah, that first Montrose album you held up is such a classic, and it was such a slow burner. I guess they call it a sleeper hit, because it wasn't a success in its initial, life. Slowly just kept selling over the years, till eventually it sold over 1 million copies. And now it's looked back on as one of the classic, certainly classic American hard rock bands, rock albums of the 70s. And I think that if that album had been, we're talking about an altered timeline, but I think if that album had been a huge album initially, like right off the bat, I think they would have put out 2 or 3 more albums like that. They could have been one of the biggest bands of the 70s. But obviously it didn't happen that way, and his career took a lot of interesting twists and turns.
Yeah, but it's interesting. Talking about this album, how many sort of crossovers to Van Halen there is from this. There's the connection.
Absolutely.
Like when people talk about favorite debut or the best debut album, best debut hard rock album, it could be this one, or it could be the debut Van Halen album. And you got Ted Templeman as well, haven't you? The connection here.
Ted Templeman produced, Don Landy engineered. The band is named after their guitar player. It's a particularly American style of hard rock. It doesn't have any of the sort of what you might call goth overtones of, say, like certainly Black Sabbath, but even Deep Purple, Uriah Heep. It doesn't sound anything like that. It's got a California sunshine, attitude to it, and so influential that you can go on YouTube and find really poor quality footage, but still footage of Van Halen in the clubs doing Make It Last from this album. So it exists. There is footage of David Lee Roth singing a Sammy Hagar song, something he said he'd never do. But that's how influential this album was. I mean, like, everybody who was coming up was listening to it. It didn't sell. It didn't sell right away. It was a word of mouth thing. But I mean, Iron Maiden covered songs from it, and Lee Aaron. Tesla. It's hugely influential. I think it's one of the best sounding albums from 1973. I think Ted Templeman's production was so ahead of its time. It doesn't sound, if you play this album next to almost any other album that came out in 73, it's head and shoulders above it sonically. You play this against the first Aerosmith album. I would even make the argument, and this is going to turn some heads, play it next to the first Queen album. A lot of people talk about the Queen productions, which are great, but I just think that Montrose album, when I first found that, if there'd been no date on it and it said 1980, I wouldn't have blinked. I would have thought, yeah, sounds about right.
Yeah. But it's like that with the debut Van Halen album, and I was quite late to check that out because I thought, 78, I'll get around to it. It's the 70s. But I played that debut Van Halen album, and it sounded like it came out in 1986, not 1978. It's just like, well,
Van Halen. It's so funny that they got their first two albums came out in the '70s, but they paved the way for the '80s in so many ways. I mean, I can't even imagine what that must have sounded like when that came out in '78, because none of the best of the hard rock bands that were around, Kiss and Aerosmith, and nobody sounded like that. And and I think that first Montrose album was kind of a template, four piece rock band. You get a blonde front man, and it's just weird how the similarities start all the way back there. But there's been so many times through the years where the paths have intertwined. So it's almost it was almost meant to be that someday Sammy Hagar would end up fronting them. As a matter of fact, that's at one point Ted Templeman had said, well, he was, recording that first Van Halen album, producing, and he wasn't sure about David Lee Roth as a vocalist. And he got thinking, well, what about Sammy Hagar? Now, I got to tell you, I'm glad it didn't happen that way, because what we ended up with are really, in a lot of ways, two different great bands with the same name, because they really were two separate things altogether. I happened to catch on to Van Halen, when I started listening to music really seriously in general, was when 5150 came out. So that's my Van Halen. That's my entry point. I certainly went back and got the other albums, but that was my starting point, was 5150, and hearing Why Can't This Be Love on the radio and be like, who's that singer? He's fantastic. He could sing anything. And that's the thing. He pretty much has sung everything. He's dabbled in a lot of different genres. Not everything's to my liking, but I wanted to get it all down in one book, so that anybody that's curious, that wants to check out his career, maybe they've got, the Van Halen albums, maybe they've got VOA or Three Lock Box. Because, a lot of his albums are hard to find to this day. They're obscure. But I wanted people to be able to look at it and go, okay, well, this is what he did. This is when they came out. These are the songs on them, and know where to start looking.
Yeah. And of course, a little bit different to, well, I guess your last couple of books, where the last couple have been panel books. This is just you, Tim. So you just, I guess, because there's so many albums as well, it would have been a massive book if you had, I guess, a panel doing each album.
Well, I love doing the panel books, and I'm actually working on another one, and that's a format that I really like, and you took part in the Y&T book, which is great. But there are a few reasons that I did this one myself. One was I don't think I could have filled panels up with all of these albums, because some of them are so obscure. I would have had a really hard time getting enough, getting 5 people to all talk about the Musical Chairs album. Yeah. I'm sure that I could have if I'd have really reached out, but I had a lot I wanted to say on my own about this, because, the Sammy Hagar catalog, his early years, I just remember having a really hard time finding all of his albums because they were out of print. And, when I first started buying music, I didn't have access to used music stores. I didn't have a license, I was just a kid, and I didn't have any older brothers or cousins to drive me to these places. And also there was no internet. So there was no eBay, there was no Discogs. There was, it was totally by chance that I would happen upon some of these albums. And so I had to really work hard to fill in, especially the old Capitol stuff. So when I did manage to find something, it felt like such an achievement. And I have such vivid memories of coming across some of these. And also, I really wanted to talk about how, especially in his early years, like his first 5 albums that were on Capitol Records, so starting in '76 and ending in 1980, how schizophrenic those albums are musically. It seems like Capitol Records did not know what to do with Sammy as an artist. And I think they were trying to just make him into this generalist rock guy. So you listen to any of those older albums, especially the first 3, and you'll get a couple of heavier songs. You'll get sort of like party songs. You'll get a couple mellow songs. You'll get some songs that nowadays would classify as yacht rock, and you get a couple more experimental ones, but really all over the place. Strange covers, like covering Donovan and Van Morrison and Bob Welch. very strange choices, and strange choices in sequencing of albums, like putting a really slow song as the second track on an album. He did that a few times. So I just don't think there was any way that these early albums were ever going to hit. Like, he had a couple of songs that went into the top 100 in Billboard, but there were no top 40 singles until he signed with Geffen, and that's when he really started selling albums. So subsequently, what would happen is Capitol, like a lot of labels do, when an artist leaves the label, signs to another label, and starts to get more success, well, then they want to cash in on that. So they started putting out all these compilations, and some of them are legit, like the Rematch that came out in '82. That's a legitimate, best of with cover art and the whole thing. But they put out a lot of what I call truck stop tapes, which I have a chapter in this book that talks about that. And that's when you would go, and there's CDs like this too, but that's when you'd see these sort of budget looking compilations that they're not bootlegs, they're not counterfeits. They're legitimately released by a record label, but the artist, you can tell the artist had nothing to do with them. They're really shoddy looking. Yeah, there you go. And they've got like really bad graphics. And that Cruisin' and Boozin', that one in the middle there, there's a version of that exists that Capitol put out that misspells his name. They spell this Hagar with 2 G's. So that just shows you how much effort was put into them. And yet, when I first started looking for his albums, those were all I could find. And that was the only way I was able to hear some of his early stuff, like Red and Turn Up the Music and Reckless, and some of the, and there are great songs there. It's just that when you listen to the albums they came off of, you couldn't put one of his albums on at, say, a party with a bunch of people over, and you might put on an album and it starts out really well. You're like, yeah, that's good. But then it just goes off into this mellow, and like, no, I'll put something on. Whereas the first Montrose album, or, the first Van Halen album, you could put it on, let it play all the way through, and nobody would complain. So it really, it wasn't until he signed with Geffen that he started to make, I think, more consistent albums, and really, obviously his songwriting was getting better over the years, but, he did some songs for Capitol that could have been hits. I mean, the fact of the matter is, way back in 1978, he wrote and recorded the song "I've Done Everything for You," which 3 years later, Rick Springfield has a top 10 hit with. And his version is a little different than Sammy's version, but it's the same song. You can hear Sammy's version and go, yeah, I hear that. So why wasn't Sammy's original a hit? Well, I don't think he had a label that knew how to promote him. It could have been a top 10 single for Sammy just as easily as it was for Rick.
Yeah. So I'm not that familiar with the Capitol years. Haven't really gone back to those yet at this point, but especially, I mean, I enjoy the Geffen years. So I've got all his Geffen albums up to him joining Van Halen, and even the album that he made while he was in Van Halen.
Excellent point, because that album there, that was a contractual obligation.
Has no track listing.
Yeah. But he still put out a good album. Like I'm really impressed. Like, he could have totally phoned that in and put a bunch of outtakes and and just gotten it out there to get off the label. But no, he came up with some really strong material. I've said this many, many times. I think that album is a much better album from start to finish than VOA, which was his biggest album. It's a much better album.
Yeah. I don't know. I like them both, but it's different too. It's different sound, a little bit more commercial.
And obviously, he's got Eddie. That's the cool thing. He's got Eddie Van Halen on bass, and co-producing it, and he does play lead on one song. On Eagles Fly, you can hear a little bit of tapping, and that's Eddie. But they didn't. I suppose they didn't want to make a big deal out of that, but. But yeah, I mean, once he signed with Geffen, his material did get much stronger, more consistent, and kind of more to the point. Where the Capitol stuff was just, it's a little bit like, maybe this isn't the best comparison, but it kind of reminds me of Alice Cooper in the late '70s, because his albums were schizophrenic too.
Yeah,
I mean, Alice's albums tend to be, but you'd have a couple of rockers. Then you'd have some, a couple of strange stuff. Then you have some really, really mellow songs. Sammy albums were kind of the same thing. Like, you could hear some of these early songs like You Make Me Crazy, or his cover of Sitting on the Dock of the Bay, and you would have no idea that's Sammy Hagar. You just
Mm.
you unless somebody told you and you really listen to the vocal, they don't sound anything like what you'd think would come out of him.
Yeah. Maybe it's a little bit of a sign of the times as well. In the 80s, bands were like, record companies were saying, you got to get that hard rock sound. You got to get that sort of, you know what I mean? Got to be a little bit, we're targeting you to a specific audience rather than just sort of,
Yes.
you
Well,
know,
and Geffen, Geffen was a new label at the start of the 80s. I mean, David Geffen formed Asylum Records, so he'd been in the business for years, but Geffen was a newly formed label. I think, based on everything I've ever read, that Sammy was only the third artist signed to
mm,
Geffen, the first being John Lennon, and then Donna Summer, who he lured away from Casablanca. But then Sammy Hagar was the next, and then after that they had Asia, and they eventually
yeah.
they'd have Whitesnake, Guns N' Roses. I mean, Geffen
They
was
were,
like
they were massive in the 80s, eh? They had
they
massive
they
success.
became the rock
Yeah.
label you wanted to be on,
Yeah.
and Sammy got in there early enough, and he hadn't he was popular in pockets of the U.S. In the UK, he actually did really good prior to this because his album Danger Zone, which is the last Capitol album, it went all the way to number 12 in the
Oh,
UK
right.
chart. He
Yeah.
was really big over there, but not
Yeah.
in his home country. So when he signed to Geffen, John Kalodner, the famous A&R guy
Mm,
that revived Aerosmith,
mm,
revived Whitesnake, I think he recognized that Sammy, here's a guy that's got the potential to cross over. He's a hard rock performer, basically, but he's got the songwriting smarts and he's got the vocal talents that he can do commercial stuff too. And if I tell him, work really hard, don't just record the first 10 songs you write a bunch of songs and pick the best material. He was also smart enough to line him up with Keith Olsen, who was a big producer at the time. And he recognized the talent that was there. And Geffen worked with Sammy a little bit. I mean, it was he was never a huge superstar. Like, none of his albums sold anywhere close to the Van Halen albums.
mm.
But Standing Hampton, his first one that came out, was eventually certified platinum. Three Lock Box was gold. VOA platinum. That '87 album went gold, and his Best of Unboxed went gold. So he was developing and continuing to sell for Geffen Records, which is one of the reasons why it was such a complicated process for Sammy to join Van Halen, because Geffen had just struck pay dirt with him with
Mm,
VOA, with the
mm,
success of that album and I Can't Drive 55, and all of a sudden people knew who he was and were buying his albums. And then all of a sudden he wants to join
mm,
this other band. So they were like, hold on a minute, we've invested this time and money into developing him, and now he's going to leave. We need something in return, which is why, if you look inside the inner sleeve of 5150, it says Sammy Hagar's solo recordings are available on Geffen Records. Oh, anytime that you see that on a back of a record or an inner sleeve, there's always a reason. Like, there was some money, and that was a transactional thing.
yeah.
It's if you're a Metallica fan and you look at the back of the original pressing of Master of Puppets, even though they had nothing to do with Megaforce Records at that point, there's a Megaforce logo on the back. Well, that's why that was one of the conditions for Johnny Z to let them leave his label and go to Elektra.
Mm,
Always a reason for things like that. So
yeah.
Geffen and Geffen was kind of owned and distributed by Warner Brothers at the time, but there was still an awful lot of wheeling and dealing that had to happen. And the main thing is that you got to give us one more album.
Mm,
So he's had a really interesting career. I mean, here he is, with Montrose, it's an acclaimed album now, but it was a stiff when it first came out. None of his early solo material sold all that well. He started to hit some traction with the Geffen years. But then when he joins Van Halen, he's almost 40 years old. So he'd
mm,
already been in the business for a long, long time. And then he goes to an even higher, profile
mm,
where people know who he is. And those albums, 5150 is a 5 million seller. Nothing came close to the debut or 1984, which are Diamond albums now. But even in the midst of grunge, they still put up Balance in '95 and had a triple platinum album.
mm.
So not many bands can survive changing lead singers.
Yeah.
Van
No, I
Halen and
mean,
ACDC are
Van Halen, I
basically
think all
Van
things
Halen and
considered,
ACDC are basically the only examples I could think of where it worked. And in the case of ACDC, nobody was going to begrudge them because Bond died. But in the case
yeah,
of Van Halen, they had this second act that kept them going at a time when they could have just faded away. They could have been a band that we look back on. I said to someone else, we could have looked back on them like the Police. They had this great career from 78 to 84, and then they were gone. But, Sammy kept them going, and they had a lot of hits. And, some people liked it. Some people didn't. There's some people that have never forgiven Sammy for daring to replace David Lee Roth. But in the middle of all that, he still had all of these albums. He's had a very unique career. Sadly, again, I'm going to bring up Alice Cooper again. Of all the albums he's been involved with, only a handful of them were really successful. But that doesn't mean that the ones that didn't sell weren't good.
Yeah, no, totally. Yeah, I remember reading Sammy Hagar's book actually, and in his book he even says that when the offer came to join Van Halen, he was a little bit hesitant. It was like, hey, I'm actually doing quite well, and you'd think, wow, who would turn that down, or who would even have second thoughts about joining one of the biggest bands? But because like you say, he had just had his biggest albums, biggest solo album. So yeah.
Yeah, he's talked a lot about that and how, it's funny because sometimes you'll read, oh, I stepped right in there and it worked and it was great. And then there's other times where it's like, well, I really wasn't sure. I really didn't know if I loved Eddie as a guitar player. But I didn't, he never really had a lot of respect for David Lee Roth as a front man. And
No.
but
they're so different, eh? They're so different.
They're just a different approach, right?
Yeah.
And it was a risk because he was on a roll. But someone asked me what would have happened if he hadn't joined Van Halen, and my opinion is that he probably would have put out 2 or 3 more albums for Geffen that would have sold about as much as 51 or as VOA, platinum, maybe gold, a couple other minor hit singles. And then the same thing would have happened to him at the turn of the 90s that happened to most bands. Grunge would have come in and wiped, and taken him out. So Van Halen gave him a new lease on life. And really, I think that he put in the work, he put in the years, he put in the tours, open for everybody, and it was like the reward for his hard work. Okay, now people get to see what I bring to the table. And like I said, it took me a long time to kind of reconcile in my head, but the Van Halen really were 2 different bands. You've got the Dave era and the Sammy era. I'm not purposely neglecting Van Halen 3 because I love Gary Cherone. I'm a big Extreme fan. Not so much that album.
No.
But with the singer who was at the helm, it totally changed the approach. It totally changed song structures. I always used to get a little annoyed when people would say, when Sammy joined, they started using all these keyboards. And I would think, do you remember Jump and I'll Wait from 1984? Eddie was already writing like that. Farther back, and The Cradle Will Rock is a Wurlitzer, like distorted. So his writing was changing. His writing was changing, and I don't think I can't imagine what another Van Halen album would have sounded like with Dave. I think it would have been, I guess it would have been the closest to 1984, but I just don't know how it would have worked. And that's another thing. Maybe someday we'll get to hear some of, if they have done anything, maybe we'll get to hear some of what it might have sounded like. Who knows? There may be a song that's like the music to say Good Enough or Get Up from 5150 with different lyrics and Dave singing. I don't know. I'd love to hear it. I'd love to check it out. But yeah, it wasn't exactly, and I don't think it was an automatic thing for Sammy to join Van Halen. One funny thing that it didn't click in with me until I heard him say it, but he came off the VOA tour and he cut his hair. He was going to take a break before doing another album. That's why if you look at the 5150 era photos, his hair is so short.
Yeah, right. Well, I'm not surprised he wanted to take a break because he releases this in 84 and he also releases this in 84 as well, isn't it? So he'd been busy too.
Yeah. That was the one album of his Geffen career. I had a hard time finding that one too, because that was out of print. But that came out a few months before VOA, and that's an interesting album. And I've talked a lot about that on a lot of different shows. I really enjoy that album, but I can see why Geffen wasn't going to put a lot of money into it, because again, they're working on making this guy a solo star, and he wants to work with a bunch of different guys. They come up with this. It's not a catchy band name, HSAS, Hagar, Sean Aronson, Shreve. It does not roll off the tongue, no matter, And other than, it's not like you have somebody like, Crosby, Stills, Nash, and Young, where you hear those names and automatically you know who they're talking about. Hagar, okay, well, that's got to be Sammy Hagar. Shown, well, as big as Journey were at that time, did everybody know the members of the band besides Steve Perry? I don't know. Who was Kenny Aronson? You'd have to be really in the business to know who that was. And Michael Shreve, if you were a longtime Santana fan, you'd recognize that name. But together, it didn't come to anything. And there's a song on that HSAS album, Missing You, that so as the story goes, like you mentioned, Sammy's autobiography, Red, which he put it, I think, in 2011. He says that he had I Can't Drive 55 written by the time that they were working on that Through the Fire album, but he didn't put it on there. And he said, it was a song for me. And it wouldn't have fit. It wouldn't have fit on that album. Also, it would have gone to waste. Yeah. And I feel the same way about Missing You. I think that if Geffen had gone to Sammy and said, look, this song sounds like a hit, I think you should save this for your next actual album. That could have been a top 10 single in 1984. It's catchy. It's commercial. Yeah, it could have been a big hit single. I think they should have saved that for VOA.
Yeah, it's a good point. It's almost a bit of a wasted album, I think, and because especially, I mean, I don't know how much of it's actually done in the studio or is live. I mean, it's supposedly all live, right? But
I don't think it is. I think the more I've talked to people, My Hometown, the closing song, that's about the only one where you can hear any live stuff. Now, I believe they did go out, and it's an interesting idea that these four guys did. They got together. Sammy and Neil wrote a bunch of songs, and they did this little tour. They did this little 2-week tour in the San Francisco area. There was an MTV concert that aired, and there are 6 songs that did not end up on the album. And I made an error, and I've been corrected on it. I made an error with one of them because one of the songs was rewritten and ended up on one of Sammy's later albums, but I got the song wrong that it started as, so I apologize about that. But I would love to see a deluxe, CD Blu-ray package come out that had that complete concert on it and an expanded version of this album. But the first thing that you hear, you go, well, you're obviously hearing Sammy, but you're also hearing Sammy on background vocals, so that can't be live. Right. It is pretty raw. Like, you don't hear a lot of rhythm guitar. You just kind of hear that one guitar track. But yeah, there's no way they could have done stuff like animation and live and have it sound as dead on as it does. But I still think it's an interesting album, and I think there are some really good songs on it. Top of the Rock is another song that if he'd have put that on one of his regular albums, that's every bit as good a rock anthem than as There's Only One Way to Rock. That's a fantastic song. Yeah. I think they put out Geffen, would have been the one to choose the single. I think they made a strange choice in putting out Wider Shade, the cover of Wider Shade of Pale as the only single. Yeah. I think Top of the Rock, that would have been my choice. Yeah. Yeah, but they should have put Top of the Rock to rock radio and Missing You to pop radio. But again, I don't think they were planning on doing a lot with this album. And then you have the issue of Neil Schon being an artist on Columbia Records. Journey were huge at this point. And CBS is not going to let their guitar player moonlight for a bunch of albums with Sammy Hagar. They're going to want him in the band that's making the money. And the funny thing is that in the history, if you look at the history of Journey, this album had a lot to do with Steve Perry doing his solo album Street Talk, with Oh Sherry becoming a top 5 single. Yeah. And Journey were never the same after that. No. The whole power dynamic shifted, and Neil kept doing these because he'd already done 2 albums with Jan Hammer, and then he does this album, and then if anybody that's watched the Journey behind the music, Herbie Herbert, their late manager, said, you keep doing these, and he's going to want to do a solo album. It'll be commercial, it'll probably be successful, and you will rue the day that you did all of these different side projects. And by God, didn't that turn out to be the case? Because Journey came back, did Raised on Radio. They fired the rhythm section, and then they were gone for 10 years. And, but as far as Sammy was concerned, okay, on to the next album. And it turned out to be his biggest. But it's really weird that he was an established guy at this point. I mean, after like Three Lock Box had Your Love Is Driving Me Crazy, which was his biggest solo hit, went all the way to number 13, I think. So I'm a little surprised that this HSAS album wasn't more successful, unless it just wasn't in stores where people couldn't find it. Because they kind of came up with a cool logo, even though it's a clunky name, and the cover's kind of cool, but it just didn't catch on.
It's sold as a live album too, and some people are going to be a bit like, oh, I don't know, you know what I mean? It's a live album.
Yeah, I don't know any.
They might not
songs.
even realize it's original songs. They might think it's covers, or so yeah.
But if that had come out as a Sammy Hagar album, I think the results would have been quite different.
Oh yeah, and it just got me thinking. Actually, I wonder if say Sammy Hagar had not joined Van Halen, I wonder if Bad English would have had Sammy Hagar as the vocalist, not John Wade.
Isn't that something? Yeah, I mean, there are when you read, looking back, when things come out about who was almost in bands. Because there's one thing that's came out in recent years that I've heard that I think would have worked just as easily as not. The bass player on that HSAS album was originally going to be Tom Peterson from Cheap Trick, who wasn't in Cheap Trick at the time. So yeah, it's who's available at any given time, right? It's like when you hear about almost what producer almost worked with a band. Well, they were already committed to working with this band. So yeah, that happens a lot too.
Yeah. Oh no, it's very interesting. So there's a lot to cover. Just I guess we'll start wrapping it up. Like you said, there's lots of albums that he's covered here, and it's what would you say? You give a bit of an opinion, and then you're giving some facts, some information about some of the album. What I like too is you also tell us about some of the sort of the B-sides or some of the sort of rare tracks from some of the albums as well.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, I really wanted to make sure that was in there, because he does have, like any artist that's been around for any period of time, there are stray songs that don't find a home on an album. So I wanted to talk about them in context of the time period. So for example, he had quite a few songs end up on soundtracks in the 1980s. Yeah. So for example, he had The Girl Gets Around was on the Footloose soundtrack. It wasn't a hit, but it was on one of the biggest soundtracks of the year, which had to have been good for him.
Good song, I include that. Really good song.
Yeah, and I include that at the end of the VOA chapter, because that's the best place to put it in. And also, I also talk about the songs that he covered by other artists and the songs that other artists covered by him in the space, the appropriate album space. Because that's one thing that I learned when I was doing the research for this. I knew some of the songs that people had done that he had written. Obviously, I've Done Everything for You as an easy example, because it was a big hit. But I didn't know that Bette Midler did not one but two Sammy Hagar songs, and I had no idea that there was a French version of one of his songs. So yeah, it was really fascinating to look and document all of that. And I really thought that was important, because so he covered this song by Van Morrison. Well, here's where you could find the Van Morrison version. And then, in the chapter on Standing Hampton, there are two really good B-sides. Don't Get Hooked and Satisfied, that as far as I know have never been on CD and have never been digitized. And I don't know why Rock Candy hasn't done a deluxe version of Standing Hampton. They've done a few of his albums, but I definitely wanted to talk about those. So I think still there's a box set, or there is at the very least a really good 2 CD compilation of Sammy Hagar's entire solo career that is out there that could be compiled and put out, because there's songs throughout the years that he's released just digitally, and they've never found a home on an album, and they're just kind of floating, and it would be great to have all of that stuff compiled in one place. Now, in 2004, when Universal put out the Essential Red collection, that was a good single disc compilation, because it did gather up a lot of those soundtrack songs because it got The Girl Gets Around, it got Winter Takes It All, it got Fast Times at Ridgemont
Yeah.
High. It was great to have those in one place. One thing that I think they should have done is used the soundtrack version of Heavy Metal instead of the Standing Hampton version, because they're two different versions. If you've got the Heavy Metal movie soundtrack, it's the same song, but it's a different recording. It would have been nice if they'd included that in one of his albums. But yeah, there's a lot to cover. Like I said, I tried my best to talk about all of it. And another thing, all the pictures in this book are from my own collection, which is something I like to do. I think that's the same for most of my stuff. But I instead of getting pictures off the internet and having to pay for them and stuff, I said no. Every album cover, every inner sleeve, it's all from my own collection.
Yeah, no, that's really cool. And of course, as I'm sure everyone watching knows, Tim has his own YouTube channel, Tim's Vinyl Confession. So what's also very cool is as you're reading this, you can be following along on his channel as he does a deep dive on each of the albums. So I think you're up to, well, you've just done VOA, is that right? And then...
Yeah, as we're filming this, we're like a day away from the 87 album. And I always say the 87 album because it's like the Whitesnake album. What do you call it? Because when it first came out, it had no title. But then it was apparently it was supposed to be titled "I Never Said Goodbye," and it was eventually reissued with that title on it. But yeah, that was a weird thing. It's like, well, who fell asleep at the switch and let an album out without a title? But anyway, it makes for a good conversation. But yeah, we're about there, and I did that with my Kansas book, and I did it with the Y&T book, and it's a companion. It's meant to go along with this, and just really take like a half an hour or so and talk about a particular album.
Yeah, no, it's really good because you can kind of read along, and then you can listen to, and often you have a guest that comes on to talk about it with you as well. So you get someone else's.
Yeah, I like to bounce my ideas. Not everybody's going to agree with my with what I think of a particular album, so I like to bounce things off of people. And like when you talked about why isn't this a panel book, I had a hard time lining people up for this. It was a hard time. It wasn't easy to get people to talk about. The Geffen albums were easy, the early albums not so much, and the later albums not so much. Eventually I did, but I just that to me cements more and more why it's important that a book like this exists, like the Y&T and the Kansas and even the Unspooled book. If there'd been a book like this out there in the marketplace, I would have just bought it. Yeah. But there didn't seem to be. There didn't seem to be. There's plenty of books on Van Halen. Sammy's done a couple of books, and but I've never seen one that just talks about his solo recordings. Yeah. And another thing I want to mention is that the foreword to this book is by Greg Renoff, who Van Halen fans should know that name because he wrote the excellent Van Halen Rising, which chronicles their early start from. Because, like he said, they formed in 73 and the debut didn't come out till 78. What happened in those 5 years? That's a long time to not have a lot of information about it. Great book. He also did the oral autobiography of producer Ted Templeman. And so I was honored to have Greg do the foreword for this book. And Ted Templeman's an interesting guy because he's the one producer that's worked with Sammy Hagar in 3 different capacities. He worked with him in Montrose. He did VOA. And then he ended up coming back to co-produce For Unlawful Carnal Knowledge. My favorite Van Halen album, by the way.
Yeah, it's a great album. Yeah. So this one's coming up next on Tim's channel. Now, you didn't get Martin Popoff to come on and do it with you, did you?
No, Martin does not like that album. I had Martin on to talk about Street Machine.
Oh, did you? Okay, yeah, cool, yeah.
Yeah.
Good stuff.
Yeah. But Martin
gets 0 out of 10 in this book.
Yeah, Martin's been very supportive of all my endeavors, and honestly, he's really the guy that kind of convinced me that, maybe I could do this too. But I mean, he, it's funny because, he doesn't like, we have a lot, musically, there's a lot of the same stuff we like, but then we differ. I mean, the most famous example probably being Def Leppard's Hysteria. I mean, that's, I went toe to toe with Martin, an album that he, actively loathes, and I defended it on the Contrarians. And I've always used that as, joke. It's all jokingly, right? We all have our opinions on music. It's never personal. But I always say, like when somebody says something to me, I said, look, I defended Hysteria against Martin Popoff, so I'm not afraid of you.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah,
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 but
yeah.
if I recall correctly, I don't think he was big on this or BOA in particular.
No, no, no. But yeah, because he's getting into that more commercial sound. Absolutely. I mean,
Very much, yeah, yeah.
from the 70s or early even, yeah, yeah. But no, very good. And then are you going to keep going? Because like we've been saying, he's got a massive discography. Are you just going to keep going all the way through to current day on your
Oh
channel?
yeah, yeah, yeah. I'm gonna go all the way to Crazy Times, which is so far the last album
Yeah,
that Sammy Hagar and the Circle put out in 2022. So yeah, they'll be every second or third episode. I mean, not everybody
yeah,
wants to watch Sammy Hagar, so I spaced them out.
yeah,
And but yeah, they really are a companion to the book, and really, the books that I've done are all kind of a spin-off of my channel in the first place. It's just me talking about the music I love
yeah,
and maybe shedding some light on um, artists that either people have never heard of, like, Y&T, where, they were never a big band, or a band like Kansas or Sammy Hagar solo, where it's like, well, yeah, I've heard of them. I get a couple of their albums, but never really listened. And then, when I get people messaging me, hey man, I just went on Amazon and I bought a couple of CDs, that's great. That's and I hope that people, when reading the book, even if they don't agree with my reviews, but if they don't know an album that I'm talking about, they should be able to get an idea of what the thing sounds like. At least, it's like if they're a real hard rock guy and they review, or if they read my chapter on an album like Living It Up, they go, maybe I won't go to that one right away. But if they read a review on something like Standing Hampton, they may be like, this sounds more like my kind
yeah.
of music. So, it's as complete as I could make it. After it came out, there are a couple things I missed, and like I said, I did make one little error in the HSAS chapter, all of which will be remedied in the future, pressing. But I'm not going to do another version of this until we get a new. There's no point until there's a new album to talk about, which
Yeah.
I think there will be. I think there will
Mm.
be, and I'm looking forward to hearing it.
All right. Well, that's awesome. Thanks, Tim. So, as Tim mentioned, I think Amazon's the place to go if you want to pick this up. I'll put a link in the
All my
description.
books, yeah.
Yeah, I'll put a link in the description if you can grab that if you're interested. I know it's doing pretty well already on the sort of music book top sellers list. It's doing pretty well. But so well done, Tim. And thanks for coming on the show. Always a pleasure to talk with you about music. And yeah, like I said, also check out Tim's Vinyl Confessions show. All right, that's it for this week. Let me know what you think about Sammy Hagar. How much do you know about his solo career? Are you more a Van Halen guy, or what about Montrose or Chickenfoot and all the other things that he's done? Let us know in the comments. All right, thanks for watching. Make sure you hit the subscribe button if you haven't, if you enjoy this type of content. Hit the thumbs up, and we'll catch you next time. All right, see ya.